I'm going to introduce Mike Clare. He's worked with the York Region District School Board for 30 years. In that time, Mike has been a department head in 2 schools and has been seconded to Historica for a number of years. Mike has a master's degree in education, focusing on digital applications to the teaching of history and social sciences. Currently, Mike is doing contract work with the University of Ontario while developing combined curriculum digital resources with the National Council for Social Studies in the United States and various provincial history teachers associations in Canada. A few sample topics that Mike has worked on are 1776 and the Loyalists, the War of 1812, the Spanish Flu, 1918 to 1919, Stepping Out with the Spanish Lady, and a few others. Mike is also on the executive of the Ontario History and Social Science Teachers Association and has published teachers' guides and numerous articles in educational journals. So again, we're so pleased to have Mike with us this evening. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and at that time, everybody else is going to be muted. Okay. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Deborah. I appreciate the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be with you this evening. And I'd just like to start off by acknowledging that I'm a treaty person, that I'm on the Williams Treaty territory, the Williams Treaty, which was actually ratified in 2018. So it's still ongoing, and I think you'll see how the Indigenous representation will come out and in part in this presentation. So thank you very much for being here this evening, and I hope you can see a lot of correlations between what happened over 100 years ago with what's going on now. As mentioned, I have been involved in presentation of various textbooks for students and books themselves. And when I looked at the Spanish flu, I was just wondering, can anybody think of where there is some sort of memorial in the city of Toronto for the Spanish flu and the victims of the Spanish flu? I'd like you to keep that in the back of your mind. As I was doing work on other things, I looked at development of curriculum in the province of Ontario, and I admit I have been part of that development process. And in terms of the work that I've done, I also looked at how much did I give to the Spanish flu. And these are 3 of the books that I've been involved with. And if you look at what was given to World War I and what was given to the Spanish flu, I begin to wonder, why is it that the Spanish flu in all the textbooks, and not only the books that I've been involved with, but also other textbooks, why is the Spanish flu on average about a paragraph in all these textbooks? What's going on, and where do you see the memorials in Toronto? Can you name that only one? So think about that for a second, because if we look at this, you have to look at the Spanish flu. It's the greatest. It's the greatest epidemic that's happened, and it's killed more people than any other epidemic in the history, even greater than the Black Plague. Yet it doesn't get any sort of recognition. And you think about it, World War I killed 67,000 Canadians over a period of 4 years. Over a period of 18 months, 50,000 Canadians have died. And yet nobody recognizes and acknowledges those 50,000 who died. Why is that? So I'd like you to think about that as we go through this presentation. I'd like to start by looking at something that occurred in 2019.
This is what Brad Kettle normally looks like, a 43-year-old active, healthy man, a regular in the gym or on the mountain bike trails. And this is what Brad looks like now, 50 pounds lighter and significantly weaker, recovering and reeling from an experience with H1N1 flu that nearly cost him his life.
What went through my mind, I might have to deal with the death of his son.
The illness began with what Brad thought was a chest cold, but instead of getting better, Brad's symptoms got worse. After a few days, when breathing became a struggle, he finally called 911.
I do remember them in the ambulance saying that they were going to induce a coma. My thoughts on that at the time was that it would just be a day or two, they'd clean out my lungs or something like that, and I'd be fine.
Brad wasn't fine. In fact, after respiratory failure, he was put on life support. As the infection spread, his kidneys started failing as well. He then required surgery on his gallbladder. Bit by bit, this flu was causing Brad's body to shut down.
We think the H1N1 is targeting younger patients simply because they've not been exposed to H1N1 that many times throughout their lives.
Older people have seen H1N1 outbreaks before. A century ago, a Spanish flu epidemic killed 50,000 Canadians. That was H1N1. In the 1970s, known then as the swine flu, H1N1 made a return. And then 10 years ago, a new version of H1N1 appeared. That year, health officials had to scramble for a vaccine. But the good news is, in the 10 years since, the H1N1 virus hasn't changed, meaning the vaccine in use now is almost a perfect match. Getting that flu shot could have saved Brad from his whole ordeal. Now he just hopes his experience will prevent others from making the same mistake.
What I thought was a cold turned into the flu, turned into a near-death experience for me. Really shocked, I think, everyone that I know.
The Europe's West Global News, Calgary.
Give you a moment just to read what's on the screen. I think you can sense from this reflection from Dr. Clark's daughter, granddaughter, that there was a sense of frustration and a deep sense of sorrow and profound loss dealing with the flu in Toronto in 1919. So what I'd like to do with you this evening is I'd like to look at, first of all, an introduction to the flu, its impact on World War I, the characteristics of the flu, and then look at it, and all the way through, I'd like to look at it from a Toronto perspective and how the flu influenced the city or as we went through things. And I'd just like to mention that there's an iBook that I've produced at the end that I'll give you a link to, that if you'd like to get into more of this, you can. So every good epidemic deserves a nursery rhyme.
Strange disease was ravaging the population. It seemed to primarily target those between 16 and 35, the young and the healthy. In extreme cases, patients presented flu symptoms in the morning. By evening, they were dead. Children were orphaned, some totally alone with their brothers and sisters. Husbands and wives were widowed, with the surviving spouse left to fend for themselves. In approximately 16 months, 50,000 Canadians would die. 1 in 6 households would be affected. Public gatherings were banned, schools canceled, and public events forbidden. Yet the flu spread. Hospitals could not keep pace in some communities. Undertakers could not find sufficient coffins, and cemeteries did not have enough space. The market demand for a funeral was high, and undertakers were making big money. People did not know what hit them. To the superstitious, it was a natural result of war that plague should follow. To the scientific mind, it was a viral infection unlike anything seen before. To Canada, it was an epidemic that would bring profound change. It was the Spanish flu, the best documented pandemic in history and the least known.
If you look at the Indigenous population, first of all, this story about the Indigenous veterans coming home, and you look at what they face coming home, and the story of Chief Joseph Davis from the Brunswick House First Nations, and that's just north of Chapleau. What he came to home to was it not a unique experience. There are many stories of veterans returning home to situations like this. But the Indigenous population of Canada was hit the hardest by the flu. And the Department of Indian Affairs at the time said, thank God for the Spanish flu. This might help us solve the Indian problem. So there's some things we have to look about as how the flu impacted a lot of Canadians, especially its impact on the war. One young man by the name of Alan MacLeod, he joined the Royal Flying Corps and became a pilot at the end of 1917. And the beginning of 1918, did a couple of practice flights in the UK, and then was sent overseas in February of 1918. He went out on a flight with his observer, and while on the flight, his plane was jumped and was shot down, but in the process of being shot at and so forth, it actually caught fire. So MacLeod jumped out onto the wing struts, and because the flames were coming into his cockpit, he flew the plane as best he could, try and land it. And he landed, even though the plane was fully on fire, landed it in the middle of no man's land between Canadian and German troops. Obviously, a plane coming down and landing like that and burning attracted a lot of attention. And he also managed to pull his observer out of the burning wreckage. And in the process of pulling his observer out, he got shot and was wounded. He then, while dragging the observer to some cover, he got shot again. He then tried to move and he got shot a third time. So he laid there with his observer, protecting him and so on until nightfall, and dragged the observer over to the Canadian lines, and then received both medical attention and for his act of bravery of flying the plane the way he did, of saving his observer's life and taking the wounds that he did, he was given the Victoria Cross. So he was sent home to recover. And while recovering in Winnipeg, he received the message they were going to get the Victoria Cross, and that in November of 1918, he was going to Buckingham Palace to receive the cross from the king. Well, he never made it. While recuperating in Winnipeg, he caught the flu and died. if you look at May 1918, the British Grand Fleet could not put to sea because the vast majority of sailors were sick with the flu. And the British war strategy at the time was to blockade Germany. And that blockade was in jeopardy because the British could not put out enough ships to maintain the blockade because of their sick sailors. The same was true of Germany. A lot of their submarines could not go to sea in October because, again, the dock workers in Germany were sick with the Spanish flu. So the service required for the German Kriegsmarine was not happening. Now, that was not unique because in Victoria, BC, the dock workers only had a labor force of 21% in October. The rest were sick with the flu. So there are issues that are going on with the flu. And if we look at Germany's attempt to win the war quickly, began with what is called Operation Michael. And it was a push in the very early parts of the spring of 1918 and almost took Paris. But it ran out of strength and so on because at the beginning of the Battle of the Marne, which was considered the blackest day in the history of the German army, all of a sudden the German army was stopped and put in retreat. There are a lot of reasons for it, but one of the reasons is a lot of the German army was sick with the flu. Again, we look at Canada's 100 days. And we've written many histories about the 100 days, but in fact, one of the reasons why a war of stagnation moved into a war of movement, in part, could be related to the relationship that the German army was sick. And you can look at the percentages of soldiers, German soldiers who were sick compared to the Allied troops. Also, what happened, things like this would happen, there was a convoy of Canadian and American troops that were going out in October of 19 to Europe, and two cargo ships, American troop ships, one in the city of Cairo, collided with a second American ship. On that ship were over 400 troops going to Europe. When the two ships collided, they sank really, really quickly. Over 400 soldiers lost their lives because of this collision. It turned out that on the Cairo, those in charge of the piloting of the vessel and the steering of the vessel were caught with the Spanish flu and were incapacitated immediately by the flu and lost control of the ship, and that caused the collision. We think about the Treaty of Versailles, and a lot of the history of the 20th century has some of its origins in the settlements of the Treaty of Versailles. And in January of 1919, the American delegation led by Woodrow Wilson went to the Treaty of Versailles to do some of the early work on that document. While in Paris, all of a sudden, Woodrow Wilson became violently ill, so violently ill that his security team thought he had been poisoned, but he had an attack of the Spanish flu. Also, part of the American delegation caught the flu. So a lot of the good things that were in Wilson's 13 points never made it into the Treaty of Versailles because, again, Wilson's delegation was sick. And a lot of the other European delegates looked upon Wilson saying, geez, the effort he made was very poor. In part, he was sick with the Spanish flu. The Treaty of Versailles might have been quite different had Wilson been in a shape to deal with the negotiations. So again, looking at this, we can look at the casualties in October. And you can see that the casualties are light. Canada has 10,000 casualties, but they're saying you could survive a trench raid. You had a better chance of surviving a trench raid than if you got the flu. And on October 1st, the garrison of Toronto is now becoming sort of ineffective because, again, they've got 437 men sick with the flu. So the Spanish flu comes, and it's sped. Dr. Hastings, who's the Minister of Health, is talking about it and said it's finally arrived in Toronto, and they're going to have to deal with it. And he's saying it's coming in from the United States, which is in fact correct. But they now have to look at how do you deal with it. And even if they're looking at some of the bacteriologists that are making claims about the flu, their bacteriologists are looking in all the wrong places. The flu hits. Montreal has had a death rate of 165 people a day. Toronto had to get a special streetcar adapted to collect the dead because the hearse can't keep up with it. And in November, 3,000 people in Ontario die of the flu. And you can see here that even on November the 11th, which should be a time of celebration that the war has ended, you can see the comments of this young lady. But you think about the flu, and I have a statistic for 1918 saying that over 9,000 people in Ontario died of the flu. When you think of the population of the province of Ontario in 1918, compare that to the population of Ontario today and the percentage of people who died of COVID so far, 1918 statistically was a more gruesome year. You can see here that undertakers just couldn't keep up with the demand for funerals as well. And there are stories here, trying to get grave diggers to work. Where do you store the bodies? The difference, I think, was happening in 1918, 1919 was you could, in those days, you could attend a funeral. So there would be this common rite of goodbye, rites of passage. You could grieve, but we don't have the same opportunity of funerals today, but it's because of different reasons. But again, there's a huge problem going on. And even if you look at funerals today, COVID is doing something different to funerals that baby boomers are the ones who are probably going to take the most of this. Millennials can't get into a house. It's too expensive. And we'll come and look at that in 1919 as well. But boomers cannot get into a grave or cannot get grave sites because they are becoming priced out of the market. So it's interesting how the trend is moving along. But again, there's a lot of problems with this. Even the new hospital that was built up at Danforth and Broadview and Gerrard couldn't keep up with the demand for hospital space. So let's look at this Spanish flu and how did it come about? Well, first of all, the name. It's got nothing to do with Spain. Basically, what happened was those Allied countries that were involved in the war had a strict sense of censorship. Spain was a neutral country, and Spain was the first country to report, generally in the press, about this strange disease that was going through the country. And when they finally reported that the King of Spain, in fact, had contracted the flu. Spanish flu became the normal name that was going to take over. So it has nothing to do with Spain per se. It's just that Spain was reporting it. And to get around this, you now notice that Spain took on a little bit of negative press. What we've now done with naming epidemics and so forth is we've named it after the virus and the year in which that virus was discovered, COVID-19 for 2019. This flu actually preyed upon the young more than it did the elderly. The young hadn't been exposed to the flu in quite the same way as those, say, 30 and above had. In the 1890s, the Russian flu spread through Europe and through North America. So those people who survived the Russian flu had developed something in their immune system to when the Spanish flu came along, they were able to cope with it more effectively. However, if you were born after 1896, and by the time the Spanish flu hit, you're in your 20s, you haven't got the natural immune system to fight it off. A lot of people caught the Spanish flu. Obviously, Walt Disney caught it and survived. Enzo Ferrari caught it and survived. But one young individual at the time, Szilard, he was an American, was with the American troops, and he was supposed to go out on a patrol one morning, but he got the flu, and he was in no shape to go out on this patrol. His patrol, the other men in that patrol, never returned. Szilard managed to survive the war and go on and follow a science career, and was instrumental in the Manhattan Project. A lot of people in Toronto got the flu, obviously, but one of Canada's favorite movie stars, Mary Pickford, got it. Amelia Earhart was in Toronto at the time, and she was a volunteer nurse and wound up at the Royal Flying Corps facilities, and she volunteered to nurse sick pilots. And it's rumored, I can't substantiate this one way or the other, but it was rumored that grateful pilots took her up for a ride in a plane, and that's where she got her love of flying. Whether that's true or not, but it's a great apocryphal story one way or the other. But she was in Toronto nursing the sick. Let me just go back to it. Dorr, the original founder of Dorr Biscuits, he got the flu. And he subsequently died of the flu, so his son took over the business. And his son had also contracted the flu, and the flu had left him substantially drained. And in about the late 20s, he passed away early because of the complications from the original flu that he caught in 1919. So the grandson, Carl, took over the biscuit company. And what Carl decided to do as a young entrepreneur, he actually changed the name of the company from Dorr to Dare, and it's one of the local Toronto companies that we are familiar with. The Dodge brothers, Dodge Corporation in the early 1900s, a very innovative company with technology, bringing in the latest events in motor technology and so forth. But Horace Dodge contracted the flu and died. His brother became so distraught, he really couldn't manage the company properly. Dodge lost its technological edge. It lost its drive in the marketplace. And Dodge would never truly recover till in about the 1970s. Went on a downhill slope from there. A lot of other people caught the flu itself. FDR, David Lloyd George, S.A. Wilson. Also, Robert Borden, Canada's Prime Minister, had the flu. But the one thing that the flu did when it did attack, in certain people, the response system, the immune system, kicked into overdrive. And one of the things you get is a fever, and you get a really high-pitched fever, and it had an influence on the brain. And Edward Monk got the Spanish flu, and the screen was painted while he was under the influence of the flu and under the psychosis that it caused. There are stories of people with this who received this psychotic event from the flu, and the body's reaction to the flu, the brain being influenced, of people who were perfectly sane. And there's stories in, for example, the recorded event in London, England, where a fellow caught the flu in the morning. By the afternoon, the body temperature got up so high that he, in fact, ran out in front of a bus. He just couldn't take it. And there are lots of stories of people who were sane committing suicide, but it was related to the Spanish flu and the influence the flu had on the body. When you look at what's going on in various cities around the world, you can see how this flu is spreading, and October is the worst month of it all. But it's interesting to see which city has the highest infections. And these are, again, infections per 1,000 people. So New York is in real serious trouble. And I'll come back to why. We look at the deaths around the world. Obviously, Canada, the UK, France, the United States. Now, thinking about the United States, up until COVID-19, this was the highest epidemic disease rate. And even in the results of the 650,000, that is more people who died of the flu than all Americans who died of the result of America's wars in the 20th century. And now with COVID-19, the number is over 850,000 deaths related to a pandemic that has been politicized. You look at what's going on in Iran, and this is one thing we don't look at, but we should, and that's the global influence of the war. But look at the results in India. 17 million deaths. So a third of the world is infected or affected by the Spanish flu. It eventually will kill 1/3 of the world's population. So we're looking at how many people died of the flu, and we're now looking at a global number of around 100 million individuals died, a direct result of the flu. And the end of the flu is different in different parts of the world. In Australia, it arrives later and ends later. But again, it's a huge impact on global population. It's sometimes known as the blue flu. So you start in the morning, you're not feeling well, you're kind of looking a little droopy and so on, the normal things we have when we get the flu. But by the end of the day, you've got a lack of circulation, and that lack of circulation turns the extremities blue. So It's very quick if you get it. And we look at patient zero is an American. As the flu spreads, we look at Toronto, 1918, October 8th, you can see that there are 160 teachers short and 10,000 students are absent because of the illness. Think about what's going on in schools today and how many schools are reporting absenteeism among staff and students. And if this flu were to happen today without some of the things we have in place, it could kill, if it was to reoccur without those, it is estimated that it would kill 350 million people today. If you look at up in the Danforth in Maine, which is the railway yards up there were thousands of workers, railway workers, who were sick. And that would be up in the Danforth and Maine area, where the railway yards are and the communities around it. That would be a hotbed of the flu. So we look at this as a high-risk neighborhood. But then you look at other things. There's a coal shortage. How do you keep your place warm if you can't get coal in? There are people in construction. They take the highest death rate of any of the workers or high-risk groups that were measured. And think about what's going on today. We've got shortages in certain things. You can't find labor. Have to wonder, if you look at the flu itself, that's still with us. It's evolved and changed, just the same way COVID-19 is evolving. And we've got the Omicron variant that's in play today. But one of the things that it did do for Canada was it changed the way we look at health issues. It gave the Department of Health. What was happening to the response to the flu was every municipality in Canada was on their own. And it was up to each municipality to deal with the crisis, put in the rules that are in effect and those that are not. For example, the small town of Stouffville, the director of health up in Stouffville wanted to shut down the entire village of Stouffville for a couple of days to prevent the spread of the flu. Business in Stouffville virtually or almost ran them out of town because they were so upset with that suggestion. But each individual community had to deal with the influence of the flu, and some handled it well, some didn't. But what the Canadian government realized is that they need a federal Department of Health, and it needed a new approach to prevention as opposed to treating the disease. So it becomes a community problem. And didn't we start out the COVID flu by saying we're all in this together? So we're looking at then, how do we respond to the flu? And if you look at some comparisons of the flu to COVID today, everybody looked at saying, oh, the Spanish flu was a bacterial infection. And in fact, it was a virus. And viruses were not discovered until 1930s. So you couldn't produce a vaccine. And if you look at what we know about the coronavirus, we knew a lot about the virus going back to the SARS episodes in Toronto, and through SARS, and also through the development of the genome system, we were able to identify the actual coronavirus And we were able to develop vaccines that were targeted for that. So we have multiple vaccines available to us. Back in the 1918, 1919 era, there was no vaccine, and no vaccine would work. Some people said, oh, we found something. The Connaught Labs said they'd figured out a vaccine that might work in Toronto. The Connaught Labs said this, and they were going to give it to doctors, nurses, and public officials. But it really didn't work. So you think about the symptoms of the flu. Hopefully, some of you, not all of you, have experienced the flu, but if you've had the flu, you know what the symptoms are. So then, what are you going to do when you get the flu? So if you're poor in Toronto in 1918, your most likely option is number one. If you're middle class or above, you can use options 2 and 3. However, try finding a doctor. 70% of the medical staff, doctors and so on, were overseas in Europe. So the family doctors that were left in Toronto were run off their feet, and also the nursing staff. You could go to the drugstore and get something, but what? You look at, there's no vaccine available, and there was a story of a Winnipeg doctor who said, oh, I think I found a vaccine, and he had to go into police protection to get away from all the people saying, please give me a jab. There was no vaccine. There was, if there was a response to it, there was, and this is a rally out on Yonge Street, the anti-vaxxers were alive and well. Also, there's an editorial on the upper right-hand side there of the Canadian Medical Journal saying the anti-vaxxers are spreading disinformation. We've got to fight against this. Sound familiar? The drugs that were available as we first went with COVID, weren't there things like, well, let's open the windows, get fresh air in the room. You can visit with friends if you've got fresh air coming in. But how many rooms can, in a modern high-rise office building, how many rooms can have a window that opens? So now we're into HEPA filters and so on. But that idea of fresh air was important, and we can meet outside. As well, there were all sorts of different remedies that you could get, and the rules on those remedies were not well defined. And so you look at this Ayers cherry, it's got heroin in it. Chrysophus does nothing, but it's a good ad in the Globe and Mail. This wonderful device, can you imagine walking around with that? What does it do? Violet ray ozone generator. But you've got to stay hooked to that machine, reading it all the time, breathing in it all the time. And of course, how many of you now have got packets of disinfectant wipes or have gone to a place where it's sold out? What's going on with that? Lysol is still making wipes, and I think maybe they made some money then, and I think they're making some money now. There was this whole debate about masks. Do you wear a mask? So this is a little bit of a poem that was in the Edmonton Journal at one point. But if you look at the masks we have today are infinitely better. First of all, an N95 mask is more tightly woven and covers your face more effectively. But if you look at the mask that was available then, the fabric was not as tightly woven. It was basically collects all the moisture from your breath. It becomes a great breeding ground for bacteria. Even though it's the flu is a virus, you can get all sorts of other bacterial growth in these masks themselves. They were better than nothing, and they did work to a certain degree. But when you have mass gatherings without masks on, so if you look at pictures of what goes on November the 11th in various different cities across Canada, the number of people with masks on compared to the number of people without, and then look at the outbreak of the flu that follows, it's quite high. The mask did do some work. And some municipalities put in a law that you must wear a mask. Also, the flu affects you, and it depended on where you live. So if you lived in this neighborhood, which is from the ward, which is just north of Queen's Park, and you look at the earnings that people had. So in 1921, a blue-collar worker made about just over $1,000. White-collar worker made over $1,600 a year. It was calculated that in order for the family of 5 to move out of poverty, you need to earn $1,655 per year to raise above the poverty line. If you look at statistics today that are similar to this, it's been estimated that in order for a family of 4 to live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Toronto, the average minimum wage that person must earn to be able to afford and be out of poverty in Toronto is $29 an hour minimum wage. Looking at the housing that exists, you'll find that many people are living, many families in one house. So they're overcrowded. And with this doubling up and living close together, the flu will spread very, very quickly. So what I've posed to my students at times is I've asked this question: if you were the eldest child and mom and dad are sick and the rest of the family is sick and you've got to do the laundry, how long is it going to take you in 1918, 1919 to do the laundry? And it's interesting to get the response of the kids. If you're selecting item number 3, you're correct.
In the working classes without servants, the housewife's existence was one of almost unalleviated drudgery. There were no labor-saving devices. Families were large and wash day was sweat day. Heating water in a copper boiler, bending over washboards, wringing out clothes, and pushing a 5-pound hand iron as much as 2 miles before the family wash was finished.
The 1918, early 1920s was a period of social disruption in a lot of North American cities around and also around the world. Returning vets came home. They came home to no job, or a lot of them came home to no job. Very little compensation for what they had done, pensions or that type of thing. Plus, they came home to the Spanish flu. So this is the Thanksgiving parade going past Queen's Park, in Toronto in 1920. I think that sign says a lot about the mood of the population. Also, there's a request from the population too, asking for women to come in and become nurses. And you get it from Ottawa, nationally. You see it from the Ontario government, looking for nurses to volunteer to work. People are urged not to use their phones unless it's important, because phone workers in Toronto, it's all done by women, basically women, switching the lines. It was a manual transferring of calls. And they're sick. They can't come to work. There's a labor shortage. This is an article that was syndicated both in Toronto papers and also in the Markham Economist and so on. I think the first paragraph goes a long way in explaining why the flu is not commemorated. And part of that answer could be it's a woman's issue. And it didn't get the attention that it truly deserves. Also, if you look at this in terms of social expectations, if the husband dies, the mother will get, for those children and so on, will get greater sympathy from the state and from local charities. However, if the father dies, then the social expectation is that the father still has to go out and earn a living. Who's going to look after the kids at home? There's no child support, there's no child care. And so the net result is a lot of fathers wind up putting their children in care, into orphanages and so on, and saying, as soon as I get back up on my feet, I will come and get you. So there was a swelling in the orphanages in Toronto. The first province that brings in a widow's allowance, mothers, for mothers, is Manitoba, but it was very restrictive and very Anglo-Saxon. So the pandemic changed Canada. There was a lot of things that happened. It's the beginning of a lot of social movements. And I maintain that part of the reasons why the Spanish flu is not that well known is A, it's been deemed a women's issue and was not given the proper study that it should have had. Secondly, it's one of our biggest failures worldwide. This lack of knowledge about the Spanish flu is not just limited to Canada, but a lot of things people try to do, both governments, medicine, and the general population at large, failed. However, it did have an effect of communities coming together to work to try and help each other. And a lot of that help that was given at a community level was organized by women. And there's a line from that great film shot in Toronto, My Big Greek Fat Wedding, where the daughter asks the wife, well, why doesn't Dad, why don't you say something to Dad? Why don't you do something? And she says, yeah, Dad may be the head of the family, but I'm the neck and I turn the head. And a lot of the women, through this dealing with the pandemic, learned to organize, work together to get things done, changed political nature and discourse in Canada, even though they couldn't be or were not represented well enough as MPs, MLAs, MPPs. They had an influence on such organizations as the CCF, which later becomes the NDP, and they influenced a lot of social reform that's going to happen in Canada. And they influence the leaders of the time. So that's positive. The National Health Organization, that changes. But there's a lot of work that's gone on in looking at the pandemic, a lot of different things out there to look at. I've got an iBook that you can go and download for free if you have an Apple product. And you can get that from my website, and you can get the link to take you to download this for iPads, iPhones, and so on, and it's free. So the Spanish flu had a great influence on Canada, changed the political discourse in the 20s and 30s, also changed some of the way we look at Toronto and events that happened in Toronto. So thank you very much for your attention, and I appreciate this. I understand there has been some issue with my upload and the bandwidth, and I apologize for that. But if you have questions and so on, I'd be more than willing to entertain them now.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that really informative and well-documented and some really fascinating images. We really appreciate that. And we were trying to do a workaround for the audio. Jonathan was working on that, but sometimes it's hard to solve everything in these Zoom presentations. What we did was we did stop everybody's video. So if you would like to start your video again, go right ahead. So again, if you want to ask a question, you can either put it in chat and Jonathan will read it out, or you can raise your hand and we will unmute you. We can get further into this topic. Okay, so any questions, Jonathan? Do you see any questions in chat?
How did the epidemic stop? This is the first question.
Maybe I could start with how did it start, and then Eric, I'll get back to your question about how did it stop. We think the flu began when I mentioned who was patient zero. It started in Camp Funston, which is just outside of Kansas City in the States. And troops were burning garbage is the story. And one day, next day, they became sick with some virus, and that was the beginning of the H1N1 pandemic. And then it spread as these troops were sent off to Europe from Kansas. It spread all along the railway routes to the ports on the east coast of the United States. Those troops then also spread it to Upper New York, and then there were Polish troops training in Upper New York who crossed into Niagara on the Lake. It came that way. Also, sailors and so on, and fishermen in Massachusetts went up and into Nova Scotia, and the flu went with them. And then the flu spread. Troops, Canadian troops were, the conscripts were going to go to Vladivostok in Russia to put down the Russian Revolution. And as they traveled across, they were exposed to, they already had the flu. And as they traveled across the country from city to city, a flu spread with them. The flu actually, you eventually got what is known as herd immunity. So that phrase actually works. And that by the time we get into the 20s, there's sufficient people with enough herd immunity that the virus itself could not multiply and move on to its next victim. Or if it did move on, the natural life cycle of these viruses, if they don't mutate to something different, their potency becomes less and less over time. But they have less and less host for them. And so they naturally, it just has a natural sequence of dying out that way.
Okay. Next question, did the pandemic change the way in which manufacturing was done in factories?
No, I don't think it did. At that point, there may have been labor shortages, but I don't think people looked at labor-saving devices in the same way we're now looking at labor shortages in manufacturing in Ontario and saying, oh, can we automate, digitize? It did not have the same effect on manufacturing processes, mainly because manufacturing at the time was switching over from a wartime production to a domestic economy. So that in terms of major changes, I don't think it had a huge impact on the way businesses operated.
Why were older people more resilient to the 1918 pandemic?
Again, because they had been exposed to the Russian flu that came across in the 1890s. And so they had developed a certain amount of immunity. So if you had survived the Russian flu, then you had that immune system. But if you were born, say, 1996 on, you did not have that immune system. And that's why the younger people were more prone to being affected by the H1N1 virus. In terms of the coronavirus, why it affects the elderly and not the young, I think that's the nature of the virus itself, and I really don't have an answer for that one.
Okay, and the last question we have here so far is the isolation hospital at Broadview and Gerrard still there?
I don't think it is, but I honestly don't know. I think it's something else has gone in there.
Don't see any other questions right now. Don't see any other questions right now.
I think there's one more.
There is a memorial, and it's Glenn can't be here tonight, but there's a memorial to Dr. William Young, and it's in Kew Gardens, but it's the only memorial that's in Toronto. Now you could say Connaught Labs is a memorial that they did a lot of research into Spanish flu and so forth, but they no longer are there as is. But in terms of any memorial as such, there's none other than that.
Why do you think that there weren't more memorials?
It goes back to the nature of social history, and I think, first of all, it's an admission of failure, and we don't like to celebrate failure, and it was a breakdown in a lot of different areas. For example, in Montreal, where all of a sudden they put a ban on church services, the priest would go out and walk the streets and do communion from the street level and talking up to people's apartments and so forth. But we can look at, did our institutions, for example, the church, did it fulfill its role effectively? And so you can argue, how did institutions in society function for the greater good of society? Did medicine help? You know, we are looking at an amazing period of scientific growth in medicine in the 1890s on through the early part of the 20th century. There's just an exponential growth of medical discoveries, yet it could do nothing for the flu. You look at legislation. Legislation was such that there was prohibition for good reasons, but the reason being that you wanted the materials that go into the manufacturing of alcohol, let's give that to the troops overseas. They need it more than we do. But there were no medicines that worked. Doctors were desperate for something, so a doctor could lose their license if they prescribed whiskey. So you had to write a special letter of to the Minister of Justice to say, please excuse me from the law. I wish to prescribe alcohol for this person who's dying of the flu. So the medicine, you know, government seems not to be responding in a positive way. The military itself insisted on having things like war bond drives and large gatherings. And departments of health said no. So there's this conflict here. Again, it's a failure to cooperate. So there's that aspect of it. And I secondly think the people who, and I think we're looking at it in two ways, but the people who were most responsible for dealing with COVID were the women. And women's history has looked down somewhat, and therefore this item didn't get the coverage it deserves. And even if you look at coming out of COVID-19, you know, this idea of build back better, we're now saying to build back better, we need to have more attention spent on childcare and things of that nature. So we're making changes, but those weren't happening in the 1918, 1919 timeframe.
We have a bit of a comment here. It says, it seems that the Spanish flu wasn't just 1918 to 1919, but many years before. So comment there.
Yeah, can I respond to that one, John?
Yep.
You're right. The Spanish flu, there are three major theories. The one that I subscribe to the most, I think is the most logical, is the one I said about being in Camp Funston. There's also a group that say this was the Flanders flu. And there are British medical records from 1916 talking about this strange disease coming out of, for affecting wounded soldiers who had been lying in the mud of Flanders and so on. And where was that coming from? So there's that whole school of thought. As well, there's saying that this is a brand of avian flu and it was in China first and then came over. I think that theory lacks a lot of credibility. I think the Spanish flu went the other way. It didn't come from China, it went to China. So yes, you're right. There are episodes of the flu being reported in 1916 in Europe, but they weren't sure what it was, and it was not as predominant as it will become in 1918.
Did other countries recognize the lives lost from the 1918 pandemic more so than we did here in Canada?
There are small efforts in different cities. And I know that there's a wall in, I think it's Birmingham, where they've started putting up the names of people who died of the Spanish flu in that community. And and made a big mural out of it. And it's really, from what I hear, it's quite a touching display. But by and large, this pandemic is a forgotten pandemic, even though it had a profound influence.
Another comment here. I believe the Dodge brothers caught the flu at a car convention in New York City. They're in an Egyptian-like mausoleum in Detroit.
That could be well true. I honestly don't know where the Dodge brothers got it, but it sure had a profound influence on the Dodge company.
And another question: did they have vaccines before they discovered what viruses were?
Yes, vaccines have been invented, and they were in the early 1800s. There were vaccines available, especially for smallpox. And there was the whole thing about how the vaccine was made and so forth, that a lot of people, there was an anti-vaxxer campaign against smallpox because the vaccines were not as, in terms of their manufacture and so forth, were not as rigidly controlled as they are today. So yes, they did have vaccines, and the whole idea of getting a vaccination was moving along quite nicely. But again, it's sort of like, is this technology and what you're putting into your body? There were these concerns that people had about the vaccine. And I think back in those days, they may have been valid concerns.
Did Germany get it from prisoners of war or boats arriving from the US to their docks?
How it spread through the German ranks, I think it could be from the POWs and so forth that they captured. Also, their immune system, because of that blockade, the Germans, their food supply in 1918, the rationing and so on was very, very stringent. The food supply was poor, quantity was worse. So they were more susceptible to the influence of the flu than somebody who has a healthy diet. And the Allies actually had a more healthy diet than did the Germans. But again, the Americans were, if we look at this, the troops that arrived from the States into France and the docks, everybody was mingling together. So how it spread exactly, I couldn't tell you. But that, the idea of getting it from American POWs or other French POWs is makes a lot of sense, actually.
Okay, and I don't see any more questions now. So I think that's it.
Okay, thank you again, Mike, for this really interesting presentation.